So my name's Jean Rintoul, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my view on the future of wearables. There's a lot of privacy concerns, but there's also a lot of knowledge that we're about to uncover about ourselves. As a little bit of a history about me, I've been in the 3 different biosensor startups. I came here from Australia with a Motive, which was a consumerized EEG headset, and worked on that for a number of years, which was quite an interesting experience. People tried to sell it to gamers, not the best market. Then there was a neuroscience lab, Ghazali Lab, where we looked at attention and focus in the brain. And we made a computer game to prove that we could train people to focus better. Then there was a company called Basis, which was recently acquired by Intel, which was making a wristwatch that has heart rate, galvanic skin response, skin temperature, and a 3-axis accelerometer on it. It's all continuous monitoring, and it uploads to the cloud. To me, these are just the start of a number of different technologies which are going to greatly increase our understanding of ourselves, and are really just the starting points. They bring with them greater awareness, but also massive problems. And I'm going to start with the massive problems. If you talk to people about wearables in a casual conversation, when they're perhaps not trying to say how cool they are, they'll start complaining about how often they have to charge them. They'll say that they've got a number of different items and they're wearing them on different body parts. It's annoying. We've really got a long way to go. We start to think that we started with the accelerometer, which has been around for a very long time. In fact, there was mechanical accelerometers once upon a time, a few hundred years ago. We connected it to the cloud, for instance, the Misfit Shine over there. Then there's the Basis wristwatch, which just added another sensor, but is still connected to the cloud and basically the same thing. Now we have heart rate. Then we have another device, say the Withings scale, which has CO2, heart rate, and gives you your weight as well. These are interesting devices. They give us some very basic information about ourselves, but they don't tell us everything. You have to charge them regularly, and the question is, why are you using them? What is your underlying motivation for using these devices? Is it because you're really obsessive compulsive? I don't think so. It could be, but hopefully you're trying to enact some change in yourself. So the question is, what's the point of wearables, really? You can tell when you went for a run. What more do you want? So to answer whether or not wearables can ever be useful, or whether there is actually something to them, considering a lot of people perhaps have had negative experiences, not entirely negative, but pretty negative, is, can technology actually change us? That's really important, because it tells us whether or not wearables will become important, and what they could possibly do to us. And I want to discuss what wearables could become, not where they are right now, but the dream. And as an example, we've got Times Square, which is distraction capital of the world. Right now, perhaps your jawbone or your misfit is a bit of a distraction. You look at a number on your wrist, and what do you learn about yourself? A little bit, but not much. There's so much information available. How do you focus on one thing, and which one thing do you choose? Which one item is actually useful? We know a lot about a lot of different things about the body. For instance, the accelerometer tells you your steps, temperature can tell you your metabolic rate. It can tell you your sleep states. It changes when you go to sleep, so it can tell you your circadian rhythms. Temperature sensor can also tell you, if you're a woman, what time of month it is. There's things like electrodermal activity, which is correlated to excitement. An optical sensor, which is a very cheap sensor, which was on the Basis wristwatch, which is actually just used from the laptop ambient light sensor. So if you basically move those sensors and then you can reuse them for physiological purposes, you've got a pretty good consumer product. You've got the QRST waveform, which can tell you about arrhythmias. You've also got a very interesting measure, which is heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is this underlying waveform in the optical sensor, which is a lower frequency waveform than the heart rate, which can tell you about your autonomic nervous system, whether you're parasympathetically or sympathetically activated. So that's whether you're having more of an adrenaline moment or you're resting and digesting. And other very obvious sensors are actually the microphone and the camera, which I'd like to come back to in a little bit because I actually think they're very underused. Simple as they are, those are what's been mass produced, and those are the sensors that are getting better and better. So right now you've got all these information sources. It's so confusing. Which information sources do you want to look at all the time? Which one should you pick? So the optimist view is that wearables are for changing ourselves. You've got to pick something about yourself that you want to change. Many of our bodily functions are perhaps high maintenance and inconvenient. If we could possibly outsource as much of the lower level functions as possible, we would then free ourselves so that we could choose where we place our focus. Basically, that would be a technological enhancement. You would have more time to think, more time to do interesting things. So to do that, I'm going to make a horrible simplification, so just bear with me for a moment. Let's just look at the human as a black box, like we look at many other things in science, and imagine input and output systems. We have input, which is food and water. I think we're covering that. There's a lot of apps that are looking at calorific burn. There's a number of startups that are trying to estimate calories more accurately with varied levels of success. It's actually a very difficult problem. We also breathe, which is something that many people seem to not be looking at within the quantified self movement, but is actually an incredibly important piece of information. Output. Everybody does it. Poo, urine. We move, we breathe out. We have thoughts and words. So if we simplify it in that way, you can see that there's actually biases to what technologies we've worked on so far. For instance, the pedometer, it's really just looking at movement. Calorific measurements are in their infancy. We have almost nothing that's looking at breathing at all. And I'll get back to breathing in a moment. So if we looked at simple functions that could automate humans further, we could perfect calorie intake. There's also those muscle stimulators. I think many of you have probably seen them on TV. You've got TENS stimulators, which are muscle stimulators that you can trigger your muscles while you don't think about it. So that removes the motivation problem for keeping fit. Bowel movements and tracking, perhaps that's a lower level function that you don't want to have to worry about all the time, and bladder fullness and emptying. If we could automate a lot of these things, we could do other things. So what's useful health information? Here's two apps by the company that I'm part of, which is Lear. So for instance, poo, very simple. I talked to somebody just the other day about this. Her mother was sick, and she had to look after her mother, including some very base level functions. So poo looks at the Bristol stool scale, which is an FDA approved scale. What's in your stool can tell you about your hydration levels, whether you've recently had a virus, been on antibiotics. You'll notice that lots of doctors, they all ask you about your last stool or trends in your stool. People with irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease find this information very important. New parents find this information very important. On the right, there's an app called Baby Poo, which just does some basic image processing to tell you information about your baby's poo. And be it what it is, that's actually very important health information. So you've got Ayurvedic or Chinese medicine. Many people who are interested in those traits of medicine are actually pursuing this as well. Can I move this forward? Okay, another major area which most people don't look at or haven't looked at closely enough is the time when we're unconscious, which is sleep. This is an app called Snore Loop, which looks at snoring and sounds during sleep. It can look at breathing rates during the night. So that's actually quite interesting, very important. imagine, say, your breathing rate changes at night. It changes between sleep states, actually. And the definition of sleep apnea is actually irregular breathing. So it's irregular breathing for 10 seconds or more. So if you can measure that, you can get a very good idea of how bad your sleep apnea is and what you could do about it. It measures trends over time, the spectrum over the night, and can tell you a lot about your night's sleep and how well you're sleeping, give you advice as to how to improve your sleep, considering that we spend a third of our lifetimes in this state. It makes sense to optimize it. We're also not aware of it like we are everything else. You do know when you take steps, but you don't know what's happening when you sleep. There's another product, which is the Sense on the bottom right, which is a beautifully designed item, which is also measuring gases in your room, so CO2. So if you're worried about the oxygen levels decreasing at night, you can measure that as well. It's also measuring light changes as well. Another base level measurement for wearables. So these are all the areas of wearables that aren't sexy, you might have noticed. This is where people haven't gone yet, but they're actually incredibly relevant to measuring your actual health. If you wanted to get closer to understanding your own body, you should perhaps consider measuring these things. Incontinence is a massive problem. Half of all people in retirement homes have this problem. Children's bedwetting is a massive problem. If you could non-invasively sense when the bladder is full and how full it is, kind of like the fuel gauge on a car, you would actually help a huge number of people. For instance, did you know that the third largest cause of deaths in hospitals is septicemia, which is actually caused by bed sores? The reason that you get bed sores is that nurses, carers can't get around to changing people as often as would be optimal, and many people are actually getting skin irritation from lying in their own urine. So this is a massive health problem. This is huge. This is large sections of the population are dying from this problem all the time. And there are very simple things that we could help them with technologically. I suppose the end dream would be to make a very cheap sensor that could look inside the body. And there's no reason why we couldn't do that. Imagine what you could do if you had a cheap sensor that could see inside the body. Bladder fullness is really just the start, because there's a large population of people that can easily be helped from it. Wound depth, triage, intestinal blockages, heart rate, arrhythmia, autonomic tone and vagal state. It could be assistive to third world surgery in third world countries. And you could also perhaps move it up to high resolution imaging of various parts. If we stopped being a black box. So the black box is perhaps the first simplification, the first wave of wearables, but we want to take it further. We want to look inside, because that tells us a huge amount more information. We can already do this, and we're already using this for security purposes. Whenever you go on a plane flight, walk through the airport, you've got millimeter wave radar shining through you. It's been used to figure out whether or not you're carrying any metal on you. Let's imagine using it in a different context, just for one moment. Let's imagine calcite deposits due to kidney stones. We could potentially reuse it for measuring things like that. That would be a slightly different algorithm. Perhaps it's optimized right now for the shape of a gun. But we can use these same tools for different purposes, for the purposes of improving health. If we have a look at what people are already doing in biomedical imaging, it's very expensive. It's not very scalable. It's not democratized. You've got EEG sensors. On the bottom left is a gentleman wearing an EEG headset. It's got a lot of electrodes. It's not really something that you would wear from day to day. However, it's a very interesting technique. It's unfortunate that it's so burdensome to wear and so expensive. For instance, MRIs in hospitals, they cost at a minimum to purchase a new one $3 million. That's a huge amount. That's not accessible to most people, although the information and having access to the information would be invaluable. The trick is how to make this information accessible to more people at a cheap rate. So one of the major things that's happened is that we've got the cell phone. The cell phone actually has a pretty good CPU, much better than many computers did a few years ago. It seems that we need to use that a little bit more, and we could, for the purpose of biomedical imaging. So to have a little bit of a review of the progress that we've made, we went from pedometer to adding a few extra biosensors, which is very interesting because you can get continuous measurements. And let's just say we went into the future a little bit and we looked at high-resolution sensors that are handheld. And then we got them to become even higher resolution. It would be absolutely amazing what we could potentially do then. So as our understanding of our health improves, so do the feedback loops between us. As an example, the bandwidth through eyes and ears is much bigger than speech out. So it would be awesome to have ways to speak to each other which were higher bandwidth in resolution. We can see each other, we can hear each other, but we can really only express words. That's very low bandwidth. We have language, we've done what we can with it, but who knows what would be possible in the future. Even just being aware of another person's mood. For instance, imagine this is a major privacy concern, but it's also perhaps revolutionary in how we would communicate. If you just knew somebody's heart rate when you were talking to them, I think amazing things would be possible. Every deal you did would become different. Your understanding of how you made people feel, you would become a lot more empathetic very quickly. It would be fairly amazing if we just had that as a higher level of communication. That's something that we can technologically do right now, although it hasn't really been implemented to become very effective just yet. So if you imagined higher bandwidth communication being the end state of wearable sensors, where we have complete transparency of the body, that's much bigger than the internet. The internet was interesting because it networked us all together using very low bandwidth communications. So you might have had a bulletin board, now there's instant message, there's Skype for video chat. So we're getting higher and higher in the bandwidth of communication that is available to us, but we're not there yet. In fact, there's much further that we can go. And it will be exciting to see what happens when we go there. One of the problems is that I don't know that humans can actually deal with such high bandwidth information, which is why perhaps we should automate some of the base level functions, leaving us free to reuse our brains in a more optimized way. So let's just say we did manage to make wearables so that they fulfilled the black box criterion of human automation. We would have a lot of extra time. We could remap our sensors. We could explore different things. As an example, so here are the functional areas of the brain. Let's just look at the visual cortex for a moment. A picture is 1,000 words. If we're listening to language, that's going through our auditory cortex. And looking at pictures, that's the highest bandwidth input we have, actually. And that's, if we wanted to draw a correlation between our low-level state of computers in the brain, the GPU, which are having massive advances right now, is similar to our visual cortex. That's the graphical processing area. It does a lot of the graphical filtering. It's the best thing that we have for filtering information. That's great, but how do we use that? How should we use that? Perhaps just looking at the visual range of bandwidth isn't the best thing. It's certainly useful, but again, if you could scan through different information ranges, different bandwidths, you could perhaps process a lot more interesting information. You'd have more complex pre-filtering, that's for sure, but the end state would be a higher level of information processing. So if that sounds a little bit strange, I'd just like to point out that we're already doing it. So if you look at Google Glass, we're augmenting our sensors already. So basically we're adding information in the input. There's another app called WordLens. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's pretty cool. And basically, it saves you from learning languages, perhaps. Not that I'm saying languages are redundant to learn, I'm just saying it's a lot of extra effort that you can perhaps outsource to the computer, like a Babelfish in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So Wordlands, what it does is it translates signs for you. It translates words in a range of different languages so that you can understand them. Meaning that you perhaps don't need to learn another language. You can just use a tool like this to save you the hassle. Then on the lower right, you've got an information display. So the classic case of this is actually pilots' cockpits. They really want to optimize how you process information, and they only want to feed you information which is highly relevant to the moment. I would argue that that's some of the most advanced technology that will end up filtering down to us and hopefully be put on something like Google Glass. Perhaps not Google Glass in its current form, but as it moves forward, it will be. Another example is Google Maps. Everybody uses that. Once upon a time, people used to have a lot of arguments over street directories. We used to spend a lot of time understanding where to turn left and where to turn right. Now we don't have to think about direction sense at all. It's pretty much automated by Google Maps. It's great. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about the future of wearables, and that although right now they're at a base state, the future is bright and there's a lot coming our way. Anyway, thank you very much.